I was a hardcore anti-Semite, but I was actually very close to the biggest shift in my view on the topic. And this biggest shift can be summed up in two words. And these two words are...
Hi guys, this is Sahar TV, and in today's video we'll see a video of an anti-Semite who turned into a supporter of the Jews. So many of you submitted this video, and now it's time to watch it. Let's go.
Until the age of 28, I was a hardcore anti-Semite. I spread every lie and every conspiracy theory about Jews and about Israel. And yet, 15 years later, my most watched videos out there are about actually defending Israel. And the most emotional moment of my intellectual career was being gifted a little medallion by some Jewish people who lost loved ones on October 7th. But this video is not just my story. It's about how even the ugliest hatred can be unlearned. It's about what it takes for someone to change their mind and change it radically. Now, people, when I say that I was an anti-Semite, I mean it. I remember after 9/11, my very first reaction was not grief, it wasn't even shock. My very first reaction was that Mossad probably had something to do with it. This was the prism through which I viewed the world. Something bad happened, something big happened. Who could be beside it? Well, obviously, the Jews. And it would get worse, because by 21, I was actually reading, literally, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the worst anti-Semitic conspiracy theory in history. And I still have the copy here.
By the way, just to clarify, the Protocols of Elders of Zion is a fabricated document trying to show that the Jews had a secret conspiracy, to take over the world, fabricated to scapegoat the Jews.
And I remember opening this book, and I remember being disappointed because in the introduction it mentioned that, well, this is probably debunked as a fake. That this book is a conspiracy theory. And the publisher, who is an anti-Semite, must have included this to avoid a libel case. But then in the very next paragraph, we read that whether the protocols are genuine or not, the plot described in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is happening in front of us out there in the world. And then I felt at home again, because I took it as a confirmation that yes, my worldview, that there are these powerful Jews out there who control things and make bad things happen, this worldview was still legit. Another highlight of my anti-Semitism, I remember in 2006, during the Israel-Hezbollah war, I remember I was on vacation in Crete with some friends, and I remember that I wanted to find where is the local anti-Israel protest and to actually join. I had a fear of missing out, anti-Israel fear of missing out. I didn't want to miss any chance to protest against Israel and to slam Israel. Of course, the irony is that I had zero idea where Lebanon was. I couldn't point it on the map. I didn't know what Hezbollah was, and I had no idea why they were fighting Israel. All I knew, though, was that Israel was involved, and therefore Israel had to be the bad guys. This was the given. And as I got older, my anti-Semitism only deepened. I remember around 2010, my Facebook profile picture was a cartoon depicting Israel as this octopus with its tentacles spreading and struggling its neighbors. Like, as anti-Semitic as it can get. So I was so okay with this anti-Semitism, that I was okay that this was the first image the world would know about me. So if someone would connect with me on Facebook, the first thing they would see, okay, this is a guy who absolutely hates Israel. And things didn't get better when I moved to the United Kingdom. I actually recently found an old pamphlet from 2009. I'm not remember at what occasion of activism I collected it, but the title of the pamphlet is Hamas has offered peace. Hamas has offered peace. And it describes, quote, the pragmatic Hamas Prime Minister, Israel Haniyeh, as simply wanting an honorable deal for a two-state solution. That's the same, quote, pragmatist Haniyeh, by the way, you saw on October 7 in his luxury hotel in Qatar, celebrating and praying for the attacks. So these were my sources of information. This is where I drew my knowledge about Israel. And I know all this is disgusting. And trust me, no one is more disgusted by it than myself. But still, I don't think this is about me. This is about asking, why would someone like me, a middle-class kid from an educated, progressive family, how would he end up with such views? What makes someone an anti-Semite? And by the way, someone who, I don't think I've ever met someone who was an actual Jew and I had any problem with them. I had no idea what a Jew did and where they congregated and what they... I had no contact with any Jews as far as I knew. So why was I like that? First of all, let's be clear. People have free will. So the main culprit in this story was me. I was first and foremost to blame. And I'm not sure what were the psychological factors at play. Maybe at that stage, my life wasn't going anywhere. I didn't have much going for me. So instead of doing the difficult work, which would be asking, what am I doing with my life? I looked for someone else to blame. And blaming the Jews or blaming capitalism definitely felt easier than taking ownership of my life and then exercising some agency. But there were also cultural factors. Greece is a country where anti-Semitism has been everywhere across the political spectrum. On the left, of course, Israel is seen as an imperialist, capitalist outpost in the Middle East. On the far right, the far right, they hate Jews because that's what the far right does. But even I remember in ordinary household, I remember hearing things like from religious people mostly, like, the Jews are the ones who killed our Jesus Christ. And this atmosphere had an effect on me in my impressionable years. Later, I became active in the radical left. I was actually part of the youth of the Communist Party, and that shaped even more my identity. And of course, in these circles, hating Israel is a given. Hating Israel is part of the package. So in Greece, anti-Semitism was in the air. It was everywhere and it created this fuse: religious bigotry, anti-Americanism, and anti-capitalism. And to give you a precise example about what type of culture we're talking about. After 9/11, 1 in 4 Greeks, 1 in 4, thought that the terrorist attacks were justified, that they were blowback, as the libertarians would put it.
After hearing so many bad information, so much bad information about Israel, I couldn't imagine how many people think that Hamas is resistant. You know, if you're being fed with more and more and more and more bad information and more negative context and more whatever, then yeah, of course you're going to think Israel is the bad guy in the situation. But if you actually deepen your thoughts and actually investigate deeper, you'll see that we are not the problem. We've been always seeking peace, and the other side is the one causing the chaos.
And only 4 people among Greeks, only 4% supported a US retaliation, the US finding who was behind it and attacking them. This was a percentage lower even than in Pakistan. There were more people in Pakistan who thought that the United States should retaliate against 9/11 rather than in Greece. Greece was also the country where Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was treated as a celebrity in the 80s and in the 90s and in the early 2000s before he died. He was an honored guest at conferences of the ruling Socialist Party. And Palestinians were seen as the underdog, as the freedom fighters. Like we Greeks, weren't we also the freedom fighters fighting as underdogs for our independence during the years of the Ottoman rule? We were told the equivalent are the Palestinians. And in a world of comfort, a world of materialism where no one anymore stood for anything, the Palestinians looked like the modern day Davids. standing up to a Goliath, which was Israel. A Goliath backed by the global elites. So the Palestinians were alone, so we had to be with the Palestinians.
Interesting.
So it's no wonder then that I remember one of the first posters I ever put up on my bedroom was, when I stopped putting posters of football players, was that famous iconic photo of the Palestinian kid, I think his name was Faris Odeh, throwing that rock in the tank. And that photo, it felt heroic. It felt right that yes, these people are the right side of history. But here's an irony. Although I was so emotionally invested in all this, I knew, again, absolutely nothing about the conflict. I couldn't tell you the difference between the West Bank and Gaza. I didn't know what's the difference between Hamas and Hezbollah. I was just soaking up all this vibe that here we have the weak side and the weak side is the good side. So my support for the Palestinians was this strange cocktail. Part of it was idealism, and I think there was something, although completely mistaken in the historical context, there was something healthy there. But there's no question that part of it was bigotry. And part of it was a complete unwillingness to think for myself. So the culture made anti-Semitism easy. But of course, at the end of the day, the blame was for me, for not caring about figuring out the facts of reality in this case. But that's what happens when you are what Ayn Rand called a second-hander, someone who doesn't think for himself, but just passively absorbs.
When your hatred of Israel is so great, then you also cherry pick. You read only the books that will depict Israel as the evil guy. You'll read Avi Shleim, you'll read Ilan Pappé, you'll read only specific writers. But if you actually read the other side of the coin, and you actually understand both sides and understand the context, then you actually realize that Israel is not the bad guy. But the people who truly hate Israel and hate the Jews with all their hearts will only choose the sources that fit their narrative.
In a culture like Greece, in a country like Greece, if you just wait and absorb what the culture gives you, the result is you will end up what I was, someone who believed stupid and bigoted and horrible stereotypes. So that was my life till I was probably 28. So how did all this then change? And there is no big lightning bolt moment there, because such transformations usually take time. And such transformations usually begin with small cracks in the worldview that you have. There's a small erosion here, one small crack there, and then one another. And then eventually, your whole worldview at some point collapses.
There's nothing worse than admitting you were on the wrong side all along. Nothing worse. People will usually keep their views, even if they were debunked, even if they were challenged and they understand that they were challenged, they'll still keep their views because they don't want to admit their side is the wrong side. They don't.
And it was around 2013 when I started questioning my leftist beliefs. It was around that time that I discovered the Austrian School of Economics. And this was very important because suddenly I had all the answers that I couldn't find in Marxism. And it was around that time that I discovered Ayn Rand. And I got this very positive, heroic, humanist view of life, a view that I couldn't find on the left. And yet, Israel was the very last piece of that puzzle, that the last thing that I questioned from my previous beliefs. Because by that point, I had admitted to myself that many of my beliefs were wrong, or at best incomplete. So at some point I thought, what if the same thing is true about Israel? But because at that point I was mostly a libertarian, that's how I viewed myself. So the transition was from Marxism to libertarians. And most libertarians are hostile to Israel. They still are today and they were back then. So I would still be the recipient, let's say, of information that viewed Israel as a hostile, as a power hostile to peace. Also, libertarians, they're against the so-called neocons, and the idea was the United States is fighting Israel's wars. So at that point, again, not much change in terms of how I viewed Israel. I wasn't anymore an anti-Semite, so I wasn't obsessed with Jews controlling the world, but neither was I pro-Israel. I said, look, the Jews as people, treat them as individuals, but that particular state, Israel, it has a lot to answer for. It has this very dirty history filled with blood and with aggression. And yet, month after month, more doubts continued to creep in. So at that point, because I thought I would pay a bit more attention to what was happening there, I was by that time finishing my PhD, I was working at university, so I thought I need to be a bit more informed about what is happening to the world. And I had realized that clearly now the leading force in the Palestinian movement was radical Islam, obviously with Hamas in Gaza being the best example. And this was also the time of the Charlie Hebdo attack, and also the time of the Bataclan massacre. So I viewed radical Islam as a threat. Obviously, this made my view of the conflict shift a bit. Because now it wasn't so clear that the Palestinians are all freedom fighters and Israel is the aggressor.
Yeah.
So at that point, my conclusion became, I'll actually stay agnostic. Who knows what's happening there? They're probably both bad. I mean, they've been fighting forever. God only knows who is right and who is wrong. The one side has radical Islamists, jihadists, the other side imperialism. That conflict is not for me. But I was actually very close to the biggest shift in my view on the topic. And this biggest shift can be summed up in two words. And these two words are facts and history. It was actually getting a bit more accustomed, almost by coincidence, to the history of the conflict that made me view it in a drastically different light. So I've always had this intellectual curiosity. Whenever I get into a topic, I want to hear it from the horse's mouth. So for example, when I was studying the conflict from the point of view of someone who wants to see both sides, I got access to some very rare sources, as this booklet, from example, from the 1970s by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. I don't think that there are many people who have something like that. Or when I study fascism, for example, I go actually and I read Gentile and even Hitler himself. I want to know what the most fervent advocates of that side are saying. So when it came to Israel, I went to an Israeli friend and I asked him, give me a book that really makes the case for your side. Like, send me your best. And that friend handed me an old book by no other than Benjamin Netanyahu. Of course, this book was written decades ago, before Netanyahu was the person who is today. And the book was called Durable Peace. Durable Peace. Now, obviously, reading a book by Israel's current prime minister, that wasn't going to convince me. This is not why I changed my mind. But it was the first time when I was reading that book that I came across arguments that I found so outlandish that I felt I had to go and double check them. Because I was convinced that this is Netanyahu, these arguments which I've never seen before, this obviously must be Zionist propaganda. Here's one such argument that had a big effect on me. That Israel is actually tiny. That Israel is actually a very small country. I know it sounds obvious, but actually the book opens with comparing Israel to the Arab world, simple as, let's say, size. And the Arab states together, they're about 500 times the size of Israel. Mm-hmm. And here's the thing. After all these decades of being so strongly opinionated on Israel, I actually bothered for the first time to look at an actual map. And turns out that Israel is only about 65 kilometers wide on average. And actually, if you remove the West Bank, in its original borders, it's just 16 kilometers wide. 16 kilometers.
Tiny.
And I thought, how had I never realized that? Because this means, the fact that Israel is so small, it means that there's a massive existential risk that this country is facing. If you know anything from military theory, there is zero strategic depth there. Which means one military defeat can be the last defeat for Israel ever.
Yeah.
So I realized...
And by the way, that's why the Jews are fighting and winning, because we know that this is the only country we have. We know that if we get eradicated, we have nowhere to go. So that's why we fight until the last drop of blood.
You always thought that Israel was the Goliath, but there's no Goliath there. There is no David versus Goliath battle there. And then came the next bombshell. The next thing I never heard and I couldn't believe. That in 1948, 5 Arab armies invaded this tiny state on the first day of its existence. The Arabs invaded Israel. I thought it was the opposite. That couldn't be true. So literally, first thing I go is I check Wikipedia, War of 1948. It turns out that was true. And then I discovered that there was a partition plan and the United Nations had offered to the Palestinian Arabs a state, and actually in quite good conditions in terms of the type of land they got.
The Arabs received most of the land of the British Mandate of Palestine. You have to remember that we also have Transjordan that turned into 100% Arab land, and that is also a part of the British Mandate of Palestine. And then from the remaining 20%, the Jews received approximately 11%, and the remaining Arabs would receive, if they would have accepted, the additional 9%. So the Arabs received in total 89% of land. Don't tell me we took all the land. And we didn't take anything. It was legally established.
And the Arabs rejected it? And they chose instead to try to throw the Jews into the sea? How come no one had ever told me this? How is it that I didn't know all these things? But there were more surprises to come. I always thought the occupied territories, there was a Palestine there, and then Israel took it. But the occupied territories were not Palestinian before 1967. They were under Arab control for decades, and yet the Arabs did not bother to create this Palestinian state.
Correct. And this is, by the way, one of the strongest points. If Egypt controlled the West Bank, it became the West Bank because Jordan annexed it, and it became the West Bank of Jordan, of the Jordan River. Why didn't they create a Palestinian state for all these years? Same applies to Egypt. Why didn't they create a Palestinian state? Because they had no intention in creating one. They just had a mission, a vision to destroy the Jewish state, Israel.
And then these Arab states in 1967 again go at it, trying to wipe Israel out. And that's how Israel got the West Bank and Gaza? What? And then in 1973, turns out the Arabs attacked Israel again. Actually, I didn't want to believe it. Wait, so you're telling me that so many times Israel is on the defense? And then the biggest thing I couldn't believe. When Israel made peace with Egypt, they gave huge amounts of land back to Egypt. I thought Israel is imperialistic. How can an imperialist give back land? And again, I literally didn't want to believe it. I was saying this comes from Netanyahu. There can be no more biased source imaginable. But then I went and cross-referenced. I remember I spent time reading Britannica. I dug through mainstream sources. I went back to my university books on the conflict that I've never bothered to read. And turns out all this checked out. But then the biggest shock was still waiting, and it came into this second round of rabbit hole research on the topic. Apparently the Palestinians had been offered statehood, not once, but at least in 5 different occasions. And every time the Arabs say no. My entire life, I had believed the opposite. That Israel was the reason why there was no Palestinian state. And again, I was wrong. So by around 2018, By that time, I was 35. The shift was almost complete. I didn't hate Israel anymore. In fact, I started to see that Israel had some very legitimate claims in the long Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, I wouldn't go out of my way to defend Israel at that point, but I was no longer neutral. I was sympathetic to Israel because I also felt a bit guilty. Like all these years I was believing these things and I was espousing these things that were not true. Now, this was the time around 2018. I was also diving a bit deeper into Ayn Rand and the objectivist movement. And it was through objectivism that I first heard a defense of Israel that actually clicked with me. Because this idea that, we should defend Israel because because of ancient history or because the Jews deserve a promised land. And now, none of that ever resonated with me. Actually, I'm an atheist and I don't pick sides in a conflict based on tribal allegiance and who was there 1,000 years ago. I don't care, to be honest. But what clicked for me, and this was again...
By the way, this has nothing to do with atheism. Archaeological diggings prove that the Jews were here, that they had sovereignty, that they had control, that this was their land before the so-called Palestinians. So it has nothing to do with atheism. It has to do with history. And if you deny history and you claim that the Jews, the colonizers, took the place from the indigenous people, the Palestinians, you simply don't know history.
An approach by some objectivist thinkers like Elan Journo. What made sense to me was this, that Israel is worth defending mostly because in this conflict, it is the one society in the region fundamentally geared, let's say, towards life. What does this mean? That what it's the goal is that men and women, Jewish, Arab, Christians, black, white, who live in Israel, they are allowed to pursue their happiness, their dreams, and their values. Of course, with caveats. For example, I never agreed, I can understand it, but I cannot agree with the obligatory military draft. But big picture is that at its best, Israel is a society oriented towards people being allowed to live a good life.
I'll pause the video right here and include the full video in the link in the description. The reason why people are obligated to go to the army is because if we don't, our country is going to be wiped. If there's no people in the army protecting Israel from the sky, from the land, from the sea, we will be wiped. Egypt is going to attack the first day it's going to happen. Jordan's going to attack the first day it's going to happen. We're going to have attacks from all the Muslim countries because there's no army. We're weak. And that's the best place to attack. So Israel must have soldiers ready 24/7 to every scenario possible. That's why. But I have to say this video is truly amazing, and I understand why so many people wanted me to react to it and watch it. It's amazing to see how people shift and change their minds. And also for me, as a person who's bringing the Israeli case, in front of the world, it's awesome to see what resonates with people and what doesn't resonate with people. And he's right. Israel promotes life in the biggest sense possible in the Middle East. More than Lebanon, more than Syria, more than Egypt, more in Jordan. People are the most free in Israel than all the other countries around Israel. So he's right. But wow. Beautiful transformation. I'm glad he was able to fact check. And if you're questioning your position right now, I would advise from you to read books about the topic. The Case for Israel by Alan Dershowitz is incredible. The Industry of Lies is incredible by Ben Dror Yamini. There's other great books that you can read and educate yourself on the topic. Because the moment you read the truth, your entire mind will change, not necessarily on the spot. Just like you said, it's a crack. It takes time. But when you will read the books and read the sources, you'll see that you were lied to all these years. You were always missing context. You need to read the sources that are on the other side as well in order to reach an opinion. If you'd like to watch more of my stuff, please check out my channel down below. If you like what you see, don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel and hit that notification button so you can be notified every time I upload new content. If you'd like to support me and the channel financially, you can do that using Buy Me Coffee or Patreon down in the links below. Also, we now have a Discord that you can join down in the link below. And now you can become a YouTube member and enjoy specific YouTube perks. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.